Hey there, YouTube. I'm Ikitsu. This is the Ikitsu Times. Welcome to my channel. Welcome to a little bit of Sins of Solar Empire 2. So today we're going to be talking about the defensive structures for the TEC faction, and we're going to be talking about them in sort of the context of that previous video that I made about the structures. So if you're wondering about the different types of attacks that I'm referencing, go watch that video back there. We're going to start sort of at the beginning. We're going to go through these pretty quickly here. So the first building is the autocannon defense platform. This has got pretty decent stats all around. It's got actually fairly good armor and armor points. The thing about it is it has no shields, which does make it feel a little bit flimsy sometimes. It does actually get killed a little bit faster, in my experience, than the other examples. Just because it has like no shield burst, which means that it doesn't have any sort of like regenerative effect from that. It doesn't have any innate regeneration, but it can be healed by other things that TEC has access to. Very good damage against lighter targets. It has been upgraded here. It used to have 250 Pierce on its gun, so it does actually have a little bit better performance against a wide variety of targets currently. Now, in the first type of attack here, we talked about raids. This is not a very good platform against raids. Its circle that it can sort of defend here is pretty small. It doesn't have a particularly good track record against those kinds of targets. It's a very slow-moving sort of defense platform as well. In terms of its rotation speed, it doesn't really get its guns online against that kind of target very effectively because it does have them very, very fixed forward. Very, very strong forward bias towards its fire power there. So the autocannon defense platform does not do very well at all against light raids. I would say that this is probably the worst, actually, but it's pretty close. They're all pretty bad at it. The only thing is that this thing has worse fire rates than, firing cones than the other ones, which really, really does hurt it. Now, against siege ships, this does similarly. It's simply going to get avoided. It doesn't really have any sort of contribution to that kind of a situation there. Now, once we get into actual real battles with the enemy fleet, the fact that this is a little bit fragile, generally speaking, does mean that it does get blown up pretty fast. That is a bit of a problem for them in that sort of straight up fight, but their damage is really, really good in those sort of situations there. Once we get to the really large fights, the fact that they're quite fragile really starts to hammer them, but they're pretty affordable for TEC. Like, TEC can afford to get a whole bunch of these pretty easily, so it's not the end of the world if a bunch of them get destroyed, so long as they're capable of doing a bunch of damage to the target, slowing the enemy down in those sort of attacks there. In addition, the new thing that changed for them is that they got the new Flechette Blast, as well. Of course, they do have a higher Pierce now than they used to. But the Flechette Blast is basically a point defense sort of cone here. It has a fire rate of once every 45 seconds, which is really, really slow. But it's capable of dealing a good amount of damage, 50 damage, 50 Pierce, out to a good range in this big cone against enemy strike craft, against enemy missiles, making it so that the autocannon defense platform is actually really good at softening up a whole bunch of fighters or defending against a big wave of missiles that are heading towards all of your structures or key buildings or whatever it is that they're trying to defend. Maybe you're going to pair it up with a starbase, in which case they're going to be able to blow up those missiles that are heading towards the starbase, or swat down a whole bunch of fighters that are sort of flying around it. This has added a good amount of utility and strength to this in the situations where it was already pretty useful, because the autocannon defense platform was, at the end of the day, still just a vessel used in the event that your opponent is going to actually try to fight you. They're not really good against anything that is trying to evade your defenses. This hasn't really changed. All in all, I'd say this is probably a pretty good defense platform, but I don't think it's an amazing one there. The next one here is going to be the Gauss defense platform. And this is your dedicated anti-capital one. Now, it looks like it's got a little bit more armor and hull points than the previous one, but it's actually very fragile when we consider the fact that you can get two autocannon defense platforms or one Gauss defense platform. That makes this thing really, really easy to chew through. Its one Gauss cannon does have good damage and really, really good Pierce, but its damage output doesn't really scale super well because the Gauss weapons don't have the best upgrade path, and its damage is a little bit lower, so if you're up against lighter targets, the autocannon defense platform is more than twice as good as the Gauss defense platform. However, against capitals and stuff like that, this thing does put out a decent amount of damage. and does have a pretty good secondary ability now. Now, this thing has no business whatsoever trying to fight off raids. It has no ability to do that whatsoever. It has no ability to fight off sieges whatsoever, since they'll just, again, skirt around it. And its gun's not necessarily the best against siege ships. At the very least, the autocannon defense platforms are very damage efficient into siege ships. The Gauss defense platform, not so much. Against capitals, however, this thing does excellent work. So if you're getting attacked by a real fleet there, you can have a good concentration of Gauss defense platforms. They have got access to Mason Bolt as their new ability, and this does just makes them better at the thing that they were already good at. Interestingly, because of the way the math works out, you can actually get some pretty good results from a Mason Bolt on something that doesn't have very much armor, where you strip it from having 50 down to 0, so like that does technically make it so you can kill that target off way faster, but usually you don't really care that much about the armor value of something that's got an armor strength of 50. However, this does mean that these things can be quite good into things that are lighter than you would expect in terms of the Mason Bolt, because you can fire that at something that's not like your main capital target, have these all focusing firing on the capital, but you can spread out the Mason bolts to some other targets that your other stuff is firing at. I don't have the APM for that. I don't have the patience for that. I'm just going to focus fire all of these onto the enemy capital. They'll all fire their Mason bolt onto the capital and basically not give me a whole lot of results out of that. However, it does do good damage. An extra 150 damage spike plus the additional bonus armor damage does actually mean that the Mason bolt is capable of doing some additional chip to whatever you're trying to take down. That's quite nice. If you're trying to focus at capital, every little bit of damage does make a difference. And if you got like 10 of these things, you've masked them up or whatever, that's actually okay. I still think this is a pretty bad defense platform, and it's probably the one that I would consider kind of the worst currently in the meta. Next one here is the hangar defense. This thing's actually quite interesting. It's quite good. The hangar defense for the TEC faction used to be the stronger of the two defense platforms, the hangar defense platforms. Vasari obviously doesn't have a hangar defense, but Advent had 3 squadrons, sure. Whereas this thing has got the 4 PD autocannons. The thing is, you can get 3 of these things for every 2 Advent hangar defenses, which does kind of suck for Advent, or did kind of suck for Advent. Right now, that's not really an issue. But the hangar defenses for TEC are very, very cost efficient. They're 2 supply, and they're capable of providing you a good amount of additional damage as well as protection for the rest of your stuff. If you got a bunch of these mixed in with your cluster of other things, they'll help protect against missiles by adding in that 4 PD autocannon DPS to the fight there. They'll also help finish off like weakened strike craft, and I think that they pair really, really well with the autocannon defense platform. So having those two both around does do a lot. Now, again, you're looking at fighters and bombers here. You're not looking at a ton of Pierce. So if you do have to fight capital ships, you do still have to get the Gauss defense platform to a certain degree there. But this thing I think is interesting. It's really good against enemy raiders. Not only are the strike craft good into raiders, but the PD autocannons can be useful against quite a lot of them as well. If they decide to try and just take out the hangar defense itself instead of just flying past, this thing is capable of defending itself a little bit thanks to those autocannons, especially against like corvettes and stuff like that. Against raiders and stylats, it's also capable of staying alive a little bit longer against those. But the fighters and bombers are really what does the work in that sort of situation. Now, you can't just have one hangar defense and fend off all of those things, but just having a cluster of these can really ruin the day if somebody's come in with a whole bunch of raiders. Against the siege ships, similarly, the hangar defenses do quite well because they're capable of getting all around the gravity well. The bombers are going to be a little bit better in that situation against a lot of those, but the fighters can still put in some okay work in that situation as well if you don't see it coming. So this thing I think is probably your best bet into those sort of early game cheese fights where your opponent's coming after you with those. And if you're trying to build like up a defensive sort of strategy, the hangar defense is probably going to be your most versatile opening for your defenses. Of course, ships are going to be like usually better, but if you need to defend somewhere, hangars are going to be your best choice early. And then as the opponent decides to actually like come and fight you, you're going to want to start building and developing your other defenses around your hangar defenses, because the hangar defenses will help then defend all of your other ships by having those point defenses around there. So if you're getting attacked and your autocannon defense platform has not got Flechette Blast, but a bunch of missiles are coming towards it. If you got a cluster of hangar defenses, they'll shoot down some of those missiles, making it so that your autocannon defense platform survives a lot longer and is capable of doing a little bit more damage over a longer period of time. Same with if their strike craft, they get hit by the flechette blast, they're all still alive because the flechette blast isn't really going to one-shot them or anything like that. The Suddenly the PD autocannons are going to be swatting those down really, really quickly because they're already heavily damaged. So that would be a quite good situation for that hangar defense there. Now, the change that they made for this one makes it a little bit better into the last situations, but it was already kind of okay into them. The hangar defense has access to the enhanced production. This has no real effect on raids. This has no real effect on sieges. But if your opponent is fighting you for real, they're almost guaranteed to shoot down some of your strike craft. This will activate enhanced production. You'll build your strike craft back up about 33% faster is what that actually ends up being, with a minus 50% build time. This is a good way to keep your damage like at whatever value it sort of was, but it's not a huge bonus. I would say that this is like kind of a 10% upgrade to the hangar defense platform, but it was already quite a lot stronger than the Advent ones. So I do think that this is probably warranted that this is a weaker upgrade. So I think that this is okay. It just makes it they're a little bit more reliable into the late game fights. The late game fights, I tend to find if you're fighting directly, the other two platforms do perform a little bit better. But the hangar defense is unique in that that additional point defense could be the difference between like your stuff getting killed by missiles or not getting killed by missiles, your defensive cluster. So all in all, I think the hangar defense actually stays a little bit more relevant a little bit longer. In addition, if you're fighting against Advent, the hangar defense is kind of necessary. If you're playing against Quell, the hangar defense is what keeps you in the game, because otherwise, if you don't have access to hangar defense, your opponent casts Quell on all of your structures, you lose 100% of your ability to defend yourself against like any kind of like attack. Carriers are still going to be effective there. The hangar defenses are still going to be effective there because your strike craft will still be out there. So they're still useful in that sort of sense there into the later game where you're getting attacked directly. But against like Vasari, against other tech, I would say the hangar defense is ancillary in those situations to the Gauss defense and the autocannon defense platform. But I'd still rate it higher because of its strong utility during the early game and relevance during the late game. I think it's all in all actually a really good defensive structure for tech. I don't really build it that often because, like, against the AI, it's not as important since they don't use raids, they don't properly siege, they just directly fight you. But still, I do think that is quite excellent. The retrofit bay is your repair structure. This is the last one here. The problem with this is that it costs 3 supply slots, so you could build like 3 autocannon defense platforms instead of 1 retrofit bay. If in the time that it takes for your opponent to kill like 3 auto defense platforms, this thing runs out of antimatter in that sort of same amount of time. It would have been better for you to just buy 3 more autocannon defense platforms instead of getting the retrofit bay, right? Like, because then you'd have like 4 firepower instead of like 1 firepower plus the repairs. But there are instances where this is really, really good. This is great for keeping like your starbase alive. The heal on it is actually quite strong, and it can actually keep you in the fight for way, way longer. But it's kind of difficult to really judge it as being worth all the slots that it is when it runs out of antimatter so quickly. I kind of wish this thing actually only spent 10 for every repair, but say Livy, it is still pretty okay. But for like reference, the Advent healing structure is the factory, which costs 1 civilian slot, whereas this costs like 3 military slots. So if I'm like building a defense cluster, tech is going to have like one of these things and then say 12 defense turrets, whereas Advent is going to have like 15 defense turrets and like 3 factories. And at that point in time, like Advent is healing better, and they've also got more guns, which are slightly superior to yours. So there is kind of that element to it. I do think that the retrofit bay is a little bit nerfed. I think that could be honestly a little bit better, but oh well, whatever. It's fine. It still has a niche. It's still quite good for what it does. I just think that it's a little bit pricey for what it's doing there. All right, so by the way, obviously the retrofit bay only useful against like pitch battles where your opponent is trying to push through your defenses. Anyway, next up is going to be the Argonev. Out of all of these starbases, I actually think that the Argonev is a little bit the weakest, but not by like a huge amount or anything like that. This means that thanks to TEC Enclave having access to the Twin Fortress ability, uh, TEC Enclave obviously takes it for having the best starbase because they can just have two of them. Two starbases obviously better than any one starbase in the game here. Now, the Argonav obviously not very useful against either the raids or the sieges because again you get it quite late into the game compared to those. It's immobile, so it's not going to be able to get at them. It's a little bit better into sieges than it is into raids. The reason for this is that it can continue firing while spinning, whereas all of these other structures, while you're spinning the planet, if I were to go into the planet here and I were to rotate, these things would all stop firing, whereas this would continue firing. So the starbase, if you put it next to the planet, can still actually just rotate and keep up next to the siege ships as they're trying to run around and can do a little bit better against that. But realistically, the starbase is here for actually fighting. Now, obviously, the starbase does have access to the Argonav planetary shield array, which does keep your planet alive through a siege and makes it really unpractical to siege the planet with the Argonav around it. So in that sense, it's capable of blunting it only if you manage to get the Argonav planetary shield array. That does take you a little bit of tech to get to, though. Usually by the time you actually get this, it's going to be too late for that kind of rush. And you're going to be using it to stop your opponent from sniping your planet while you're in the middle of a fight, because that can also happen there as well. The other thing that it has now that it didn't used to have, it does have access to the phase jamming ability, which does increase the charge time of enemy ships that are moving into the system. This helps with raids in that it does mean that if you have gotten Argonav up somehow really, really fast, your opponent does have to spend way longer to get their raid force out of this gravity well, which could be the difference between you catching them or not. So there is actually some really good things about the Argonav into that situation there. Now this applies to like all of the star bases now. But the phase jamming does help in that situation there. Against a real attack, the starbase is obviously one of your best defenses, being really, really durable, capable of withstanding a lot of damage, capable of dealing a lot of damage out in return there. And if your opponent decides they've had enough and try to retreat with their fleet there, the phase jamming does give you time to hammer and pound away at the enemy fleet for longer while they're trying to retreat there, giving you the option to do more damage. It also prevents them from using their fleet to jump back and forth, meaning that if they're trying to do that to evade your fleets, make it so that they don't take damage because they can just stay in the phase lane, you'll be able to do way, way, way more damage to them and eventually destroy a lot more of their ships if they keep trying to do that, if you've got access to phase jamming in the area there. Now, obviously, a phase jump inhib is going to be better at this, but the starbase alone is going to be enough to deter people from trying that dance, since they'd be taking significant losses the entire time they're doing it. So the thing about this Argonav is that, generally speaking, the way that I would use it previously is that I'd want it to be like tanky, and I'd want it to like have the missiles and the starbase beams. This would just give it the sort of ability to sit there, be a brick, and deal a lot of damage. I would add the docking booms to it, and that would be about the only build that I really thought was that viable on the Argonav. Now, if it's a backline Argonav, then the trade facilities obviously would have been really good, and the construction base would have been good. But generally speaking, like the docking booms makes it so that if you're fighting a fleet around the Argonav, you can sort of repair a large portion of your fleet pretty effectively with just the Argonav. The durability ones make it so that the Argonav is as tanky as it can be. It's pretty tanky to begin with, but with those upgrades, it actually gets some of the best upgrades for its durability in the game out of all the star bases, making it one of the toughest out there. As far as weapons go, the Starbase missile launchers is your primary choice because the damage output of those is super, super high. I used to get the Starbase beams because, like, you just kind of did. It was how you got, like, that extra bit of damage there. I'm not sure that I still do that with the way that they've got these set up here. But that was kind of how it was. Like, the Starbase would just do a lot of damage. It would be really, really hard to kill. That was basically all there was to it. In a strict fight, what would happen is your opponent would blow up all of your defense platforms that were sort of around your Argonav because they die really, really quickly, really easily. the Argonav would basically wipe out a lot of the enemy fleet there because it's actually really, really high damage once you got access to the missiles. If you got the beams as well, it's capable of taking out a lot of enemies. And if your opponent's like focusing it, then like all your defense turrets are still alive throughout the entire fight there. They're going to be dealing a whole ton of damage to the enemy, giving you lots of time with that. Whereas if they're focusing on the platforms, then the starbase obviously can just clean house. So it's that sort of dual threat kind of mentality where they either ignore the starbase and take a ton of damage, or they ignore the defense platforms, take a ton of damage. Either way they go, they're going to take a ton of damage. Um, the thing that's changed is they've added a couple of new abilities here. So for offense, they've changed it so they've got access to the ion torpedo barrage. This is only if you've got access to the Starbase missile launchers. This is a very late game tech here. If we take a look here, this is in like tier 5, so you're probably not going to get this in a lot of instances. But the ion torpedo barrage basically gives you access to like the equivalent of the Advent meteor swarm, which basically hits a huge area of effect with a lot of damage with really high pierce. Now, these missiles are quite durable with 100 armor on them. This thing is capable of just using this to sort of wipe out large sections of the enemy fleet, and I think it's actually a really powerful ability. It's going to be what makes the Argonav capable of taking out large fleets, especially if you've got double Argonavs as the TEC Enclave. However, I don't necessarily think that's going to like be an instant fleet killer necessarily, just because you're in a situation where if there's an entire fleet bearing down on your Argonavs, they can potentially shoot down your ion torpedoes. That is a thing that you have to worry about there. Um, with enough support from your actual fleet, though, the ion torpedo barrage could basically dictate engagements to a large degree there. The other thing that they've added here, they've added the flak field. This is a huge radius with a pretty long cooldown, but it's up basically half the time, dealing 20 damage per second to like strike craft or missiles and stuff like that. This is basically going to make the Argonav immune to enemy missiles. Which is really, really powerful. It's going to make it so that strike craft can't really work in the area. But because the radius is so large on this, you're going to be able to protect all of your other structures against attacks there. This means that to a certain degree, against certain compositions and certain opponents, like if you're up against a lot of counteract assailants or something like that, you do have the option of going for like a build where you go with the flak field, the docking booms, and you just sort of like defend your other structures and have your other structures doing some damage for you. Unlike the Advent version of the strategy, though, you do have the potential to worry about where you're getting slammed by things that just do not care. They're not missiles, they're not fighters. They're like either beams or they're plasma or they're something like that, and they just chew through all your defenses anyway, and you're not capable of really protecting them adequately with flak field. So, while flak field I think is really, really tremendously powerful for the Argonav, it's a little bit less capable of reliably doing a strategy compared to some of the other things that are out there. It's still a very, very powerful ability. It makes your opponents way more constrained on what they can do. And it also protects your starbase really, really effectively against things that might be able to do quite a lot of harm to it otherwise. The next new thing is the Defense Grid Command Center. This thing, I think, is what you would take if you're going for that sort of vibe where I was talking about, where you're building like the docking booms and the flak field. This makes it so that all of your other defense platforms have got a minus 10% damage taken aura, as well as additional range and additional damage. Plus 25% damage is actually really, really good, and it does make things like your Gauss defense platform really deadly. And like the extra weapon range also really good. I don't think this helps the hangars that much, but plus 25% on the point defense does mean that they're taking out enemy strike craft a little bit faster. It does mean they're taking out missiles more effectively, especially with longer range on those point defenses. So that's still pretty good for those in those instances there. I think this is a pretty powerful sort of like style of doing it, but again, you run the risk of getting hit by the counter, which is your opponent has things that are not missiles, not strikecraft, at which point they'll be able to like roll through all your defensive platforms, at which point taking the Defense Grid Command Center, the docking booms, and flak field is all a little bit of a waste because your platforms are going to get wiped out so quickly. The other one is manufacturing support. This one reduces your ship build time. I don't think this is for frontline star bases. I think that's for backline ones, but it could theoretically be a really powerful bonus where you just have like a single Argonav like in a sector somewhere. You've got the manufacturing support, and they're just churning out like 100 ships per second because you got like all factories in the gravity well. So that's something new that you can do. You're already really fast at building with TEC Enclave, but this could also help primacy a little bit if they're a little bit behind on that. Enclave could also do that, just go even more crazy with that idea. But generally speaking, like you don't want this on your frontline ones. Um, so how's the Starbase really changed for this? The Argonaut, in my opinion, has changed in that you now have a couple more options here. You could rely more heavily on just having the Starbase missile launcher plus the ion torpedo barrage for your offensive purposes, whereas before you would also want the Starbase beams and the Starbase missile launcher, and then just go like full defense there. If you go for the ion torpedoes instead, you've got the ability to more adequately wipe out enemy ships there. You do also have the ability to go a little bit more all in on offense. It used to be that I would typically get a trade facility on most of my star bases just because it would be quite good, but now I can instead get like 3 offense and then get like 5 defense, and that would just make it a very killer-y type starbase. The other thing that we've got going for us, we do have the ability to go for auxiliary hangars, and hangars is our sort of a composition there. If you're up against Advent, I would always recommend going for like all hangars and all hangar defenses as far as your defenses go. The reason is that the strike craft will still be able to fight against Quell. So you'll at least be able to do something. I think that Advent will still have like no problem clearing out your starbase as well as your other stuff, even if they're fighting off a whole ton of fighters, because they also are probably going to have a bunch of fighters, which will keep them alive long enough to do that. But this is the sort of maximum amount of like delaying them that you'd be able to do. Typically speaking, actually, the way that you delay Advent attacking your star bases is your star base is just there. They have to kind of deal with it, even if they've got Quell. So if you've got access to like all of the upgrades to durability, this thing's surviving for a million years, that'll still work. But if they get a good Quell off, they could even get like your retrofit base, so it's not even capable of working. So you do have that additional strategy there, but we've gone from having like that as an emergency strategy against Advent, having like everybody else, you go with the Starbase missile launchers, Starbase beams, and then like a bunch of defensive upgrades, to having an additional option to it, even though it's a counterable one. I think that that's kind of interesting. I don't think that it's going to make it so you're any better off against raids, though. Obviously, this comes in a little bit too late for that, and again, not really good for sieges. Just a little bit better for taking on the enemy fleet head on there. Now, this does also mean that the Argonaut is a little bit better at protecting a phase jump inhib. However, phase jump inhibitors, typically speaking, you would put them behind the starbase anyway, which meant that the starbase would body block missiles that were coming towards it. This is because the phase jump inhib doesn't really care about range. It works across the entire gravity well. So you could put it back here and it wouldn't really make a difference. This meant that you were already capable of blocking missiles, and to a certain degree, you could also help protect against strike craft already. That meant that if the enemy wanted to snipe out a phase jump inhibitor, they were already avoiding using things that you could block with the new support style Argonaut. So that doesn't really change for them. The phase jump inhibitor is still going to be either protected because your opponent's using missiles and they can't get past the starbase, or they're going to be able to sort of snipe it because they're using plasma, for example, which would let them sort of snipe that and then leave if they wanted to. So anyway, that's sort of the changes that have been made to TEC. I think that they've made it so that TEC is pretty similar to the way they were before, although like a little bit stronger overall. I don't think that they've radically changed how most people are going to use like their Argonaut. I think the best bet is still going to be take the Starbase missile launchers, get a whole bunch of defenses on there. Maybe you get the flak field as a new item because of how strong it is, but I don't think that you rely super heavily on a whole ton of defense platforms because they're still pretty fragile, pretty easy to kill. And I think that you're still looking at a situation where, you know, you get the most value out of the autocannon defense platform. You only get the cost defense platform if you really need to focus on capitals. And the hangar defense is great for early game and sort of petters off a little bit, but still remains useful into the mid-late game, even though it relatively balances out to the other two. So in any event, though, that's going to be our video about TEC defensive structures. Hope you found this one enjoyable, and of course, as always, hope to see you guys all next time.